Is this the best photorealistic lens sim add-on for Blender? Hey, Gleb Alexandrov here for CreativeShrimp.com. Recently I've had a chance to test a new commercial add-on for creating photorealistic lens simulation in Blender, Lens Sim by Håvard Dalen. Kudos to Jack Toth for connecting us. After trying an early version, I can tell you I've never seen anything like that. As a matter of fact, not only in Blender but in any software. Well, over the years, there were a couple of attempts at recreating vintage lenses in Blender, but nothing on that level. You'll need to see it to believe it. A full disclosure, this is a commercial plugin. It does have a light version that is pretty affordable in my opinion, but that's still a commercial plugin. I included my affiliate link in the description, so if you buy it using this link, I will get a small percentage. Okay, with that out of the way, welcome to an extensive walkthrough for using the Lens Sim add-on for Blender. Let's have a look at the Lens Sim add-on essentials. I'm gonna use the full version here. So I've created a nice little scene with a few character models placed inside an HDRI environment. We've got a regular blended camera as well. I'll hit numpad 0 to jump into the camera view right away. So that's our camera. This add-on uses path tracing to achieve the photorealistic results, so that's the cycles only business. I render with GPU. It also could be a good idea to use real-time denoising. Okay, so that's my setup. Now, to use the Lens Sim add-on, we have to go to Blender Preferences first. Basically, I have it already installed. Lens Sim simulates real-life lenses with Ray Portal BSDF material node. So that's the Pro version I have. Basically, I have already activated it. If you want to install it from scratch, though, it's a matter of finding the file you've downloaded after buying the add-on, either the full or the light version, and then simply dragging it onto the Blender's UI. Hit OK to confirm, and that should do it. Alright, now in the right toolbar, the new Lens Sim panel should have appeared. Over there. And there we can either create a new lens, or actually convert the current Blender camera to the Lens Sim setup. I'll go ahead and click Convert. And instantly the render view should have changed, and the camera object in the viewport should look like that, and we should be able to see the extra tiny lens objects there, just like that. And it should be pretty much ready to go. This dish-like object, by the way, in front of the camera is where all the magic happens. Without going into the weeds of a technical lingo, the add-on makes use of a new Ray Portal node that has recently been added to Cycles, which works as, as a portal into another rendering dimension, kind of. That object in front of the camera is bending the light rays like a real lens would do. In brief, it's super efficient and fast, and all the math magic happens right in shader, so there's practically zero rendering overhead. So thanks to Blender developers and to Håvard and all the people contributing to that Ray Portal feature, now we have the real lens simulation with a really great performance. What does it mean for us Blender users? That we've just gained access to real lens schematics. Here at the top we have a drop-down with the presets, which are modeled after the classic lens designs. Helios, Nikon, Canon, Kodak, Zeiss, Vivita, so on and so forth. For instance, now we can simulate lenses like Helios, that is famous for its swirling bokeh pattern, for instance. All these presets have been modeled using the real lens schematics, and unsurprisingly have the vastly different, not only field of view, but also the aesthetics of how they render stuff, how they treat bokeh, what's the minimal focus distance, how soft and bloomy it is, and pretty much anything else you can imagine. For a rendering nerd like me, that's like a goldmine, like Klondike. Personally, I have a soft spot for the old Soviet lenses, so I will go with Helios 44. Now, if we reduce the passport to opacity in the camera settings, we'll see that the add-on actually generates the circle of illumination, and then it fits it into the sensor using various modes that you can select over there. Like if we go with the focal length and reduce it a little bit, we'll actually notice that the add-on is actually rendering the circular shape indeed, if it's a circular lens design. And if it's an anamorphic one, then it would render more of an oval shape, like that. Anyway, this circle, or oval in this case of illumination, is then fit into the sensor like it happens in real cameras. Other than that, we can treat it like a normal Blender camera, moving it around and whatever. So it's really elegant. Let's have a look at some basic settings. The f-stop refers to the aperture opening of the lens through which the light can pass to the sensor. So it's like stopping down or opening up the real lens pupil. And just like it should, it affects the depth of field. Then there are various methods for focusing. By default, the plugin uses its own focus empty, which can be moved around on the camera view axis to shift the focal plane to get different objects in focus. Notice how depth of field breathes a bit, how the shape of that out-of-focus object gets stretched in the manner that is characteristic to any particular lens selected. Well, not that this effect is always desired, but if you're aiming at photorealism when pulling focus and animations and stuff like that, that could be a very realistic looking effect indeed. Then it can be changed to focus object or to distance, which is fairly self-explanatory, controlling the focus plane using the distance in meters. When using the focus empty, there is a control for unparenting it from the camera. When unparented, changing the camera position wouldn't affect the focus plane, which could be pretty convenient. It makes focus stick to the surface. With that out of the way, I'll bring back the full passepartout to constrain the view to the virtual sensor only. Another pretty cool thing that the add-on makes possible is the accurate chromatic aberration right within the lens. Alright, before trying it out, there's one more setting here, which is camera scale, which just changes how big is the lens in camera object in the viewport. Okay, the chromatic aberration simulates the colorful optical distortion that happens within the lens barrel. A famous colorful fringing effect. It does leave an imprint on the render speed though, this effect in particular, because it makes it slightly harder for cycles to calculate the light paths that were split, the way the different wavelengths of light get split when passing the glass layers. So it could be a nice touch for this type of renders that demand extreme photorealism, but it creates a little bit of an overhead. Most of the times I would keep it off while working on my digital shots. A few words about the inner workings of the plugin, which we don't really have to care about, yet what makes it special, like I've said, is the math that went into the optics simulation. On clicking render schematics, we'll actually see the lens system exposed in the viewport like that, alongside the light path if you hit rays, showing how the light rays would converge on the sensor and that sort of stuff. That being totally unique to any particular lens. All modeled after the real lenses. Personally, I don't think I have enough technical knowledge of the subject to fully appreciate the math and the research that went into recreating these schematics in Blender, but to an idiot like me it looks super impressive indeed, and I'm glad I don't have to sort it out in my head to be able to use it. That's good. So yeah, here we can check the schematics if we want. Some more technical stuff, feel free to skip. If you expand the advanced settings and then the lens data tab at the very bottom, that's where all the technical data for the lens has been input. The squeeze factor and God knows what. The surface curvature coefficients, you name it. Once again, the good thing is that we don't have to know all of that to be able to use the add-on. So I'm showing it just for posterity reasons. Just so we know it's there. It involves ray guiding, which is a fancy way of saying it uses a clever technique of making it render fast. Having said that, I'll close that tab to never visit it again. Let's continue the essentials walkthrough though. Most of the important settings are hidden under the Advanced tab. Within the Object menu, there's an option to hide these lens shapes in 3D view. This is just a cosmetic change. The passepartout, it can also be tweaked from here. Then clip start and end, the regular stuff found in the camera settings. Now the sensor settings. It's pretty cool, actually that's also physically correct. By default, the sensor image is upside down and potentially squeezed. It depends on the lens design, whether it's anamorphic or not. So these checkboxes flip it and potentially unsqueeze it. Well, if the lens was spherical to begin with, like regular Helios 44, there would be no squeeze involved. And if it was something anamorphic, it would involve a fair bit of horizontal squeeze, so it would have to be unsqueezed. That's how the anamorphic lenses work anyway. Another interesting one is aperture, about which we'll talk a bit later in this video. And lens dirt. That's something I'll use a separate scene to show, so stay tuned. The lens dirt. A peripheral yet pretty interesting feature. There are two types of lens dirt available. Upon activating the first one, we'll need a texture. So I'll open up this fingerprint one. So what it does, it adds some roughness and also blocks some incoming light at the same time. The contrast of the effect can be tweaked with the help of this RGB curve to make it slightly more prominent. You'll see that it looks like these smudges on the surface of the lens. It has some extra parameters to play with, mainly the light scatter, which in other words is the diffusion, like a physical refraction of light. A higher roughness should make it way more obvious what's going on, although I wouldn't go with the roughness that high. And then there's also the light block, which also can be tweaked. From min and max gives us a way for tailoring the effect to the point of making it look really greasy, like a poorly maintained lens or something extremely old and just messy. Generally, you wouldn't want it to look like that. Yet here we go. The mesh distance is an interesting one. You see, the first lens dirt type has a real geometry in front of the sensor that can be pushed further away, making the effect come into sharpness. So it becomes even clearer, the smudges and stuff, as long as the lens can focus on it. So that's something you can play with as well. My god, it's dirty. That would be a total nightmare to deal with if that was a real lens. So that's the first type that is of most use. The second type is arguably slightly less versatile, as it's a purely shading effect, featuring no diffusion, just the light blocking. Moving on to the split diopter. What this does is let you apply different focal lengths for various parts of the lens. For instance, upon checking the first diopter, you can give it a wider field of view. It would create a pretty unique and somewhat stylized effect. The same goes for the second diopter. I'd imagine this could be pretty useful for photographic experimentation in some edge cases. This gradient between diopters can be rotated to make it go vertical or any direction. Then the distance is another thing that can be controlled for even more stylization. And then the whole thing can be offset as well. That's the gist of it anyway. The next one is tilt shift, the effect that tilts the angle of the focal plane relative to the camera sensor. It can be found over there. It's not always super useful. I'm sure you've seen this effect in movies and such, applying the miniature look to everything. You know? Actually, let me fire up a new scene to show it in a better way. I bet you've seen this effect in real photography. Let's say we have a city aerial shot that we want to make look like a diorama. With tilt shift, it's pretty easy to do that by changing the x-axis tilt, for instance. It's a very interesting looking gimmick. Maybe the y-axis as well, for even more dramatic effect. You see what I mean? It's not the effect for the everyday use in 3D, but depending on the footage you're dealing with, on the scene you're dealing with rather, that could be a super useful technique to have in your arsenal of 3D rendering techniques, that is. It can be pivoted to, let's say, animate this. Just like you imagine. And can be shifted around as well. That makes sense, as it's called tilt shift after all. Hit like if you think this video deserves it. Arguably, some of the most interesting settings can be found in the Emulation tab. Here, things like bloom and glare, distortion, blur, anamorphic settings, and so on. The bloom effect emulates something like a pro mist filter, which, if you're unfamiliar with it, is a diffusion filter used in photography and videography to soften the light and reduce contrast, creating a subtle cinematic glow. Then glare also falls into the same category. Basically, it's like smearing Vaseline on the lens for a dreamy look. This technique was used to add a romantic atmosphere in all the films, stuff like that. Distortion simply adds a fisheye-like touch to the image, bending it like a fisheye lens or the other way around. Pincushion distortion. We also have the Radial Blur control somewhere. That could be used for some otherworldly effect. It definitely falls into the crazier photographic effects category for sure though. But it's there if you need it. Now I would like us to have a look at the general tips and tricks for using this add-on and some of the controversial settings. There's a panel called just like that. Generally you don't want to mess with it as it can break the rendering pipeline, but anyway, I'll show what it can do in just a moment. For now though, there's a few settings worth noting. If you already have a camera in your scene and you want to convert it to the lens sim camera, what is worth doing before that is adjusting the clip start. By default it's 0.1 and it's much safer to set it a bit lower, like 0.001, as some effects have a chance to get clipped otherwise. Something else to keep in mind is that sometimes to match the focal length of the blender camera, in addition to selecting a lens with a similar focal length, like 85mm here, in addition to that you might want to change the fit type to focal length and tweak it manually from there to match the blender's camera focal length as closely as possible. Now onto the aptly named controversial tab. As I've said, you won't necessarily want to tweak these settings, but if you want to force a certain focal length no matter the lens schematics, you can do it using this slider. And it may break a few things, but anyway. It could be useful, for instance, if you went with a certain lens that you like 200mm Konica Minolta Hexanon, and obviously by design it won't support a wide-angle view. It's a telescopic lens, my god. But let's say you like its character and you just want to enforce a wider field of view, which wouldn't be possible straight out of the box. What you can do though is use that slider to enlarge the circle of illumination of that lens kind of artificially, and then it should kind of work like a wide lens, if that makes sense. It's still a controversial setting because it can break a few things, but it's still a neat little tip that I borrowed from the main tutorial for the lens sim add-on by Håvard on his YouTube channel. I totally recommend checking it out, of course. There are some amazing demos there as well. Another notable parameter found in this tab is global scale. Changing it forces all the elements of the lens, say the lens setup itself, adapt to the new absolute size. And in relativistic terms, it makes the whole scene or the whole world appear smaller or larger. The use case for it is when you want to achieve a more shallow depth of field, as if you're shooting a miniature. Because as we remember, the depth of field depends on the absolute measurements, so that could be pretty useful. Then I don't think I have mentioned that many of the sliders, like chromatic aberration, even though they seem to have the limit set to 1 and cannot go higher than that, still it's possible to just input the higher value manually, like 5 or more, and that would create a much stronger, crazier artifacts, simulating an uncalibrated lens or just straight up broken optics. Something I wanted to mention is that the add-on supports the portrait orientation too, if that's something of interest. I mean, when we convert the lens to the add-on format and choose specifically an anamorphic lens, like Helios with the anamorphic adapter or 35mm Sirui anamorphic lens, we kind of stumble across an issue. Well, the circle of illumination of such lenses is not technically a circle, it's more like a horizontally skewed ellipse. It's true for any anamorphic lens. So to fit it into a vertical or portrait aspect ratio, we need to rotate the camera by 90 degrees. To do that, we can just press this button. That's it. Now, all we need to do is just fit it using the focal length adjustment. Whoa, we've got to the tasty bits. Anamorph/bokeh. Simulating the anamorphic lenses is one of the things I'd be interested most. It's just my thing. I love this look. All these settings can be found in the Anamorph/Bokeh tab. It's worth reiterating though that among the lens designs themselves are some anamorphic options obviously, and some lenses are just regular, so their circle of illumination is circular indeed by design. Most of the lenses are like that in fact, but there are some anamorphic schematics as well, which have an elongated circle of illumination, and just different characteristics by design. So what I want to say is that the lens design in the first place defines the anamorphic look, and then we have these settings to crank it up. Like we can additionally tweak the squeeze factor of any lens, and that will affect the character of the bokeh. Then the bokeh aspect squeezes the out-of-focus elements furthermore. It becomes especially clear with the higher DOF factor, or depth of field factor. Anyway, swirliness adds that Helios 44-like look that makes the out-of-focus plane go spin, which is extremely cool. The bokeh aspect's weird is just that, a really weird looking distortion for creative effects, I guess, or just for giggles like so many other things in computer graphics. Then the bokeh swirliness can be somewhat fine-tuned, whether you want it to be weaker near the optical center or whatnot. All these settings would become slightly more evident with a more shallow depth of field. Well, the f-stop of any lens can only go that low. So if you want to have a bigger, softer bokeh and just more out of focus, you can either move the camera closer to the focus object, making the background go soft. That's how you can achieve a more shallow depth of field. So you can either do that and use the fundamentals of photography, or change the scene scale, or returning to this setting, you can just crank it up. And that will enhance the depth of field, bringing out all the sweet anamorphic bokeh properties along the way. Thinking of it, you won't always want the depth of field to be that strong. It can look ridiculous. Yet, I wonder if you agree, having that look in a 3D software in just a few clicks is something of a novelty. My inner photographer hasn't been that happy in years. Okay, bringing the swirliness down lets us appreciate the anamorphic bokeh shape even more. That's the look characteristic to this sort of lenses, as opposed to a more circular but also slightly rotated, because it's Helios, look of the zero aspect. So just go swoosh, anamorphic. It can go into negatives as well, stretching it kind of horizontally for a peculiar looking scenery. I love a good old oval bokeh though, a very cinematic bokeh. Again, the depth of field factor is a global sort of multiplier to all of that. So that's the Anamorph/Bokeh settings, one of the coolest features of this plugin in my opinion. The thing about the focal plane and interesting optics like Anamorphic Helios 44 is that it gives so much character to the elements in and out of focus. It's not simply blurring the background. It goes much deeper than that in terms of focus breathing or affecting the object's proportions. And the cinematic warping, especially when used in animation, the gradual focus pull and that sort of stuff, it's just amazing. It's amazing how far the tech has gone. And of course, it's also worth noting that in some cases, if all you want is make the bokeh stronger and bigger, you may want to simply change the focal length. In addition to moving the camera closer to the object, you can simply change the focal length, increase it, going a bit longer on the lens. Going a bit longer will naturally enlarge the bokeh balls. If you do some photography, you know that for sure. So if we choose something longer, like maybe the single lens system. Oh damn, it's soft. Well, maybe Konica Minolta Hexanon then. So that could help getting a cool bokeh going, but also will add its own flavor to it. Like, wow, look at this bokeh. And just, I cannot. It's just so realistic. It's hilarious. Another cool thing that comes for free when simulating the real optics like that is vignetting, or darkening around the edges. It occurs naturally in many lenses when the aperture is closed. The f-stop is at the lower values, in other words. When the lens is stopped down like that, the edges of the circle of illumination kind of get blurry. Let me show it to you. I mean, look at the edges. And this blurry darkness at the edges starts creeping in onto the boundary of the frame, causing vignetting. So I guess that's why there is no dedicated vignette control, it just occurs naturally. Why the hell does it work so fast? Shouldn't it add an enormous overhead to calculate the complex lens curvature and trace the rays through it and stuff like that? I think a great performance can be attributed obviously to the author's coding skills, but also to the ray portal node and something called ray guiding. You can check it out. Without it, it's way noisier. The way I understand it, it has to do with some complex equations within the lens data tab specifically. Ray guiding. The equations optimizing the path that light rays take through the lens before they converge at the sensor. Again, not that I fully understand that, but I definitely appreciate the performance. I've never seen lens simulation work that fast. Okay, back to talking about aesthetics. Focus breathing. This effect is often considered to be a defect, yet it makes everything look 100% more photorealistic, if you ask me. You know, the way the default blend cameras and cycles rendering works is that it doesn't simulate this effect. Comparing it to the real-world lenses, the default focusing in cycles is similar to the way the cinema lenses work, as in, it doesn't involve shifting the field of view and warping geometry. In contrast, some of the lenses from the Lens Sim add-on do feature a strong focus breathing. See how the out-of-focus proportions get skewed and stretched on shifting the focus plane. While often dismissed as a flaw in filmmaking, for us 3D artists who infuse our work with maximum cinematic flair, it's a hell of an enhancement potentially. Let's talk some more about the bokeh shape. Here I have a new demo scene for you, an HDRI with the ground mapping. I'll explain it in some other tutorial. And a regular blend camera, focused on the distance. So nothing crazy is going on here. By the way, pressing the eyedropper icon over there lets you define the depth on the cursor as the distance, which is pretty cool. I guess it's one of the newer features of Blender. Then of course the f-stop defines how bokeh-licious is the image. Then to some extent we can still personalize it by changing the parameters within that menu, like the blades count. Let me focus on it. So the default Blender settings have some leeway for tweaking the bokeh shape. It can be rotated as well, and the aspect ratio kind of offers us the means of simulating the anamorphic squeeze. Well, to a certain extent. Yet, the default cycles depth of field controls can only take us so far. Well, those willing to spend some extra time tweaking the setup can achieve the more elaborate effects in vanilla Blender, I mean even without the Lens Sim add-on. Check out the custom bokeh tutorial on our channel for instance. Yet the Lens Sim add-on just blows it out of the water when it comes to interesting bokeh shapes. That could mean the difference between something like that and something like that. That has way more character to it, as you can tell. I will clear the chromatic aberration because it's slow. And focus on the bokeh shape now. It's already pretty unique thanks to a vintage Helios 44 swirliness, but let's take it up a notch. In the Aperture tab, I wanted to say Aperture Lab for no reason at all, there's the ray guiding checkbox that no one is allowed to untick because it's just faster with it set to on. Then Compensate Exposure just does what is advertised, compensating the difference in exposure once the lenses are put into place. What I wanted to show really quickly though is the custom aperture image. What it does is allows you to pick a custom texture to be used for the bokeh shape, which can be non-circular. These are all custom textures, by the way, so it can be star-shaped, for instance. It's similar to inserting a cutout shape in front of the sensor, so it just turns the bokeh shapes into these little stars. Pretty cool, right? No setup is required, it's just a one-click operation. And there the hearts go. Or, you know, something like that. the shape with the void in the center. I think sometimes it's referred as the onion rings or cat's eye bokeh. It makes the autofocus stuff a bit less creamy and soft and adds a little bit of chatter to it, which isn't always a welcome thing in photography, and generally lens manufacturers try to minimize it. But again, similar to focus breathing, it definitely isn't something we see too often in 3D renders, and that's why it's so cool, in my opinion. Okay, it also has the brightness compensation controls, which compensates the exposure loss when attaching that cutout in front of the virtual sensor. The overall brightness after that, or exposure, has to be compensated. It's pretty convenient that it's done automatically. It's worth noting though that using custom aperture shape reduces the overall size of the bokeh balls, almost like reducing the overall depth of field. See how it diminishes the overall creaminess? So once you enable the custom aperture, the whole thing may need a slight dove boost. Something to keep in mind, I guess. Then it works in tandem with the rest of the anamorphic / bokeh controls like swirliness. So in the end, all these settings, including the stuff from the Anamorph tab, then the aperture shape and the lens design, all of that contributes to the overall bokeh shape. I need to say, it really reminds me of my vintage lenses like Helios 44 and Jupiter for that matter. The rumors say the coating used on some of the Helios lenses was slightly radioactive, by the way, a funny detail. It's extremely funny and cool seeing good old Helios lenses used in the big budget movies like Dune Part 2, look at this swirly backdrop, or Everything Everywhere All at Once, The Northman, the Batman for that matter. Good old Helios. Then to see it replicated very faithfully and not as a gimmick in Blender? I think I'm so impressed because I really know how this lens looks and feels, Helios 44, and I just think it is insane how close we've got to simulating it. If you're a fan of the anamorphic squeeze, as far as this effect goes, the ultra-wide-angle lenses perhaps tend to have a more dramatic out-of-focus anamorphic squeeze going on. It's just something to consider if you want to go all out with this effect. To go supercharged, exaggerated Hollywood anamorphic. Then some lenses are just better with it. Alrighty, here is a slightly more informative custom aperture demo. Once again, it's as simple as pressing the button and finding the bokeh texture on the internet or drawing it yourself, or it's available for download in our custom Bokeh Shape tutorial on YouTube. Sometimes it may need the depth of field boost, to make it nice and readable, and that's it. I hope it can be seen a bit more clearly in this demo. When it comes to Radial Blur, I cannot say I'm a huge fan of it or use it often. Maybe if you need a slightly more abstract interpretation of your render, the stuff like the extremely stretched or whirling bokeh, that could be a good thing to try. Maybe. Yeah, for that matter, Radial Blur is way more abstract than just the swirling bokeh. Maybe it can be combined with even more distortion. I don't know. I'm sure you will find the proper creative application for it, dear friends. If so, don't hesitate to share it with us on Blue Sky, Threads, Mastodon, our Discord, or wherever you find us. Oh, that's a nice picture, by the way. Very abstract. I like it. Just a few thoughts before wrapping it up. There are a few macro lenses included with the add-on, so if that's something that could be of interest to you, rendering the macro shots of nature and stuff like that, I'd recommend checking it out. Maybe, who knows, alongside peppering it up with some extra effects like tilt shift to imitate even crazier macro look. Yeah, and some chromatic aberration as well. Anyway, I recommend you checking out the macro lenses assortment, like Canon Compact Macro and other such lenses. On the other hand, the ultra-wide-angle lenses, or maybe the fisheye lenses for that matter, could also be interesting to try. The Lens Sim add-on, its full version specifically, also features a fair number of them. It can be fruitful to pair it with some extra distortion maybe, or maybe some crazy shallow depth of field. Plenty of possibilities. To be fair, I don't see myself using it as often. I mean the wider lenses as the other stuff in this add-on, like 58mm Helios. The thing is, the Blender's regular camera, and let me switch over to it right now. I mean, the Cycle's regular camera has a bunch of wide-angle controls as well. We can switch it over to the panoramic type, for instance, to get a nice fisheye feel going. Usually, the fisheye shots don't feature too much, like, out-of-focus elements anyway, so there's not much to add in terms of real lens features that could elevate this somehow, in my opinion. If you want some crazy-looking rendition, you can try Fisheye Lens Polynomial, perhaps. And it already gives us a reasonable amount of control over the lens shape, all these coefficients and other stuff. Just something I wanted to mention anyway. Thank you so much for watching. That was a 30-minute extensive walkthrough for using the Lens Sim commercial add-on for Blender. I think it's a huge step for realistic rendering in general, and for Blender in particular. I included all the links in the description below, so if you want to check it out, check it out. There's the light version available as well, that is priced quite modestly in my opinion, so that could be a good start if you want to get into that, and if you want to support the author, I guess. Support Håvard. Anyway, that was Gleb Alexandrov for CreativeShrimp.com. Drink more coffee and we will change the world of computer graphics.